Welcome to the REI Now update with National REIA. Glad to see so many people taking time on their Friday afternoon. For me in Miami, it's a rainy Friday afternoon, so it's a good time to be here on a Zoom. Getting some legislative updates today from our COO, Charles Tassell, what's going on around Washington, D.C. and all these moratoriums. And we also have a very special guest today, a good friend of mine, Chris Goff, one of the founders and creators of REIPro, one of our favorite programs for real estate investing and education. But we'll give it another minute or so, just make sure everybody has time to join on. We'd love to see you guys on camera. It makes it feel like everybody is here together, so don't be shy. I mean, you know, it's my hat and t-shirt day. You don't have to dress up. Marv's outside. Looks like it's beautiful wherever Marv is at. It looks like it's beautiful there. Hey, Marv. Wendell looks like he's at the beach on some Santorini in Greece. See, I love it. I asked for you guys to put yourselves on camera and people are starting to show up. See, Rita, that wasn't hard. All you had to do is just hit, start video. Thank you, Matthew. All right, now it feels like we're all together here. So we're going to go through a couple quick announcements of some things before we get started. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Rebecca Mclean.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and thanks to all of you for attending. Just really quickly, we will be talking about some exciting ideas in real estate today, but we are not qualified as attorneys or CPAs. So even though we may be talking some numbers, if you're going to make an investment and you have questions about that, then you need to talk with a professional in your area that understands your circumstance. But we're here to promote, protect, and educate, have been now since 1983. And so we want to thank you for being with us, whether you've been with us for a long time or just showing up with us today. Thank you so much for taking time. We also want to thank our partners at the Home Depot for the programs that they have put together for us for the pros. We have special programs that include everything from paint discounts right at the register up to 20% off and paint stains. We also have rebate programs available. We also have cabinet programs, appliance programs, all kinds of great things for you there. And you can join those programs by reaching out and being a part of your local group. This is our website. If you have questions about COVID-19, you can find them here on our website. And then you can find a local REIA to connect with about resources that you may need in your area, whether it's signing up for that Home Depot program or to find out about legislative happenings or other things in your area that you need to be a informed investor. So make sure that you choose a local REIA in your area and get involved. For today, we're so excited to have Chris Goff with us, and he's going to talk about how to buy Airbnbs with creative financing. He's a 3-time best-selling author, and as Ryan indicated, he is also the co-founder of one of our great benefits, which is REIPro. And if you have questions about that, you can find that at your local REIA as well, also on the National REIA website. But for now, I am going to turn it over to our COO and Director of Legislative Affairs, Charles Tassell, to talk about things that are happening in DC and otherwise. Sir, what's going on?
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, Mr. President, for starting us off. And I always appreciate seeing everybody's smiling faces, especially as we touch legislation and either go to this shocked, horrified look or, oh my word, I can't. So I appreciate that. I'll try to keep this to the point. Right now, there's an issue going on, and you're seeing it in headlines, and it's really quite dynamic. And that is the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, which is called the human infrastructure part of the bill. There's 1.5 trillion exactly. That's the small infrastructure. That's the actual roads and bridges. Actually, 800 billion of it is, but who's counting? It's 1.5 trillion among friends. Come on. The other 3.5 trillion is human infrastructure. It's money for people, for free community college and a whole variety of things. The part that interests us most, though, is the $2.2 trillion in taxes to offset some of that 3.5 trillion. And just so you understand behind the scenes, don't get too hung up on what that 2.2 trillion is yet, because that number is going to move and it's going to change. And here's why. I want to give you a couple caveats. Behind the scenes right now, there's an effort in the House and the Senate, and the majority in the House is held by like 3 votes. That's a very close margin. It's 6 votes, you lose 3, you're in trouble, kind of thing. So the concern is you've got a number of House members who are in very difficult seats who do not want to vote on what these taxes are until they know exactly how much the bill is going to be, because they don't want to pass 2.2 trillion in new taxes if only 1.5 to 2 trillion is actually going to go forward, because Senators Manchin and Sinema in the Senate are only going to approve this much in spending. So they're trying to balance, is it going to be 3.5 or is it going to be closer to 1.5 to 2 trillion on the human infrastructure? So they only have to pass, instead of 2.2 trillion, they could actually bring it down to 1.5 trillion or less in the House on the expenses. So that's part of what's in play right now. And there's supposed to be a vote by September 27th. And as that comes forward, we'll see what really goes on. A couple of key things that are interesting. 1031s right now are not included. There are a number of small business impacts that we're watching on how pass-throughs go, including, so for example, you have an LLC, there would be an automatic 3.8% tax on that, any profits coming out of that. So there's some concerns along those lines that we're watching, and that's kind of what we're gearing up for. But a lot of the housing coalition groups and kind of businesses are gearing, but not pulling the trigger, because the initial piece that came out is in the Ways and Means Committee, and that's where it's at this point. It hasn't moved. It's not been voted on. It's kind of a first draft. We all know how drafts are. They tend to get changed. One of the key things that's not in there is also SALT. SALT is the state and local taxes. This is an exemption that was capped at 10 grand back in December of 2017. That means that if you're in one of the high cost areas, so let's pick on New York again, I like to pick on New York, and you're paying $50,000 a year in property taxes, you can only deduct $10,000 on your federal taxes. Now, everybody else looks at it and says that's fair because our taxes are only 10 to 20,000. Why should we subsidize your taxes at the local level? However, in a Senate that is 50-50 and you need every single senator to vote with you, you've got a couple of senators who said, I'm not voting for this tax increase unless I get this tax offset with SALT. So you've got concerns in the House, concerns in the Senate, and that's among the majority. And I'm not even talking about where the Republicans are at and the stuff they're bringing in. That's within the majority, within the Democrats. So there's still a lot going on. Add to that, again, supposed to be a vote by September 27th. At the end of September is the end of the fiscal year for the federal budget. Sometime in October, and that number is still moving around right now, we're going to hit a debt ceiling. So there's going to have to be a continuing resolution at some point here that basically says what we've been spending is what we're going to continue spending for some period of time. They may try to push a debt ceiling and a CRA, or continuing resolution, and get those at the same time, or there may be multiple battles on it. And those battles could dramatically impact, especially if they take up too much political capital, whether or not the infrastructure bill and the human infrastructure bill and the taxes for the human infrastructure bill actually move forward. So all of that to say, this is a dynamic situation right now. And when we reach a point where there's a decision to make and we can pull, we were going to actually pull the trigger, and we'll have voter voice out there for people to reach out to their local congressman, their senator, and communicate with them. Hey, this is a problem for us. We don't like how this IRA piece is handled. We don't like the 3.8% pass through on the LLCs. But right now, none of those are in stone, and they're not even in clay at this point. They're written kind of in wet ink, and it's smudging. So we're waiting to see what happens before we really fire this off. But I want to kind of give you that backdrop overall. We'll see together what happens. And then, like I said, as soon as something does happen that we can actually have an action item on, we will be to you on that as an action item. One other thing I want to mention, especially, is rental assistance. Rental assistance has been out there. It is slowly eking out, somewhere around 7 to 10% of it actually out, way less than the feds had thought there would be. So the Maxine Waters and her committee has actually put forward a bill and said, look, here's how you can speed this up, make it so that the property owners themselves can go through and apply. And everybody kind of said, okay, is this bill going to pass? Is this going to go to the Senate? The likelihood is it probably won't even get to the Senate. But if a few key leaders on both sides in the House and the Senate do move through and say, yes, this is good policy, then what may happen is the Treasury will take that policy and adopt it. They don't have to have it as legislation. They could just modify their regulations and work through it. And that would take care of 90% of what this bill actually does. So that may expedite some rental assistance coming out, especially in areas where you're having trouble with the communities that, they're not helping. So again, if you're having trouble with getting rental assistance, if you're running into roadblocks, make sure you're talking to your local REIA leader so that they can communicate that to stakeholders and get it stories to us, because thank Illinois for the communication they've had. We've been able to share that, to say these are the kinds of problems we're seeing at the street level, and be able to share that to folks. So keep that information coming, and just heads up, there may be some changes coming, because Treasury is very frustrated that the money is not getting out to everybody. So I also want to follow up with you, HR 5013, which is the Affordable Homeownership Access Act. We might remember this as the seller finance bill previously. This bill is one of those ones that you can only sell. It addresses the issue that you can only sell seller financing 3 properties that you own personally. You can only sell or finance 3 of those unless you've got a mortgage license or a mortgage broker handling it in a rolling 12-month period. So what this does is actually raises that number. It's getting a little more complicated, but you can look up HR 5013. It's coming out. We're actually going to be doing a voter voice on this, and encouraging people to reach out to their congressmen and senators to become co-sponsors on it. We're in this delicate phase right now where we've got a couple of key sponsors, and you want to make sure you've got balance. If you have too many R's or too many D's, they all start looking at each other like, oh, this is an R bill or this is a D bill. So we're getting a good bipartisan support on it. And I appreciate Representative Vicente Gonzalez has taken the lead on this. And so it's moving in the House, but we're going to have some sponsorship issue on that. So keep an eye out. We're going to be asking for your help on that. All you do is you fill out the paperwork, or fill it out online, I should say, and it automatically emails, goes past all the firewalls, and gets directly to the legislators in their offices. And they realize that, hey, after 3 or 4 of these, they go, this is an important issue. We need to become a co-sponsor because our constituents care about this issue. And that's why it's so important to have these out there. So I'll be following up with you on that. The last couple of things I want to mention is, if you have Apple, and I'm not talking about the new Apple stuff, if you have an Apple item, please make sure your security is up to date. There's been a big issue this week that's come out with security. So if you have Apple, please make sure your system is up to date. We were on the National REIA as part of a team with InfraGard, which is a FBI Homeland Security alert system, and we work with them and provide feedback. And this is one that they came out and said people don't realize how much of a hole that's there. So make sure you're reaching out on it. We'd really appreciate it. Just you will appreciate it, making sure your security is in place, because it's a very malicious problem that could come in and take over your system. So make sure that's up to speed. And I will kind of leave off with one last issue, just a tip for you. Natural gas prices. Our economist that we utilize has kind of given a heads up that if you have not locked in natural gas prices contracts, you're going to want to do that soon. They're expecting to see them go to record highs over the next couple of months. So I know a lot of folks have contracts that they're setting up or in process of. If you have not gotten those set up, please don't wait. This can save you some money. Get it locked in. So that's the main issues at this point. I'm not going to go into Delta, Mu, and Lambda variants and all that kind of thing. Lawsuits are flying all over the place with the presidential edict. So we'll see what happens with that as the dust kind of settles. Rebecca, do we have some questions or?
We do have a couple questions. One is sort of old business, but requesting if you have any info on updates. Have you heard anything recent about SBA loans being forgiven? I know PPP loans.
Yeah, so
Most of them, if they qualified, have been, and those letters have gone out. What about SBA loans?
my understanding is SBA is make sure you're getting the information to your bank. If you went through a bank for that or back to the SBA. And I know for mine personally, when I did it, it was literally a letter, fill out the paperwork, send it off. And about 2 weeks later, I got a letter back from them, all official looking, that said, you're clear. It's like you get that official letter and get kind of nervous, but make sure you're following up with whoever you got it, the grant through or the loan through, to get that paperwork. Make sure you're filing properly with them.
One other, more of kind of a point than a question is, how can we kind of address, would not necessarily be a voter's voice kind of thing, but addressing issues with mom and pops and emergency rental assistance, where the tenants have applied, but under the programs make too much money?
So not to go into this too heavy, but there's 2 tranches of money. The second tranche of money actually has, again, there was, if you remember, in December, there was one set of funds passed, about $25 billion passed in rental assistance. The second tranche of money was passed in March of this year, and it was 21.5 billion. That second tranche of money has more flexibility, so they can give it to higher income folks if they want to. If somebody doesn't qualify, they're out, and there's nothing that will help them at this point, as far as I'm aware of. So it will really depend on what the local group says. The point up there, I noticed this, is that I don't want rental assistance. I want my rental property owner rights. Folks, we're under the gun, and whether it's, I've talked about this before, whether it's affordable housing efforts, anti-eviction efforts, we are under the gun. Please make sure you're communicating. Please make sure you're working with folks. The last thing you want to be is that guy. And what I mean by that is that person who becomes the headline and then the story that pushes a whole nother set of issues. So make sure you're following the law, and that goes for locally, especially with health departments. Know what's going on with your health department locally and just follow those as best you can. I'm not going to, Rebecca, I'll cut me off here before I go into our denigration of our loss of our rights.
Stop there, because that could be a very long rant. Can we talk about, what about the EIDL loans, different from PPP loans? Any news on forgiveness of those?
So my understanding is EIDL, you're going to apply directly through SBA and reach out to them on that. You need to follow up. You should have a communication, because most of their communication was via email, and then they follow up with a phone call. So you need to follow up with them directly. Having said that, one of the very interesting points that was made by the Biden administration in this recent edict was there was going to be new SBA funds available. And they were going to do that for small businesses. Now, what the definition of small business is, I'm not sure yet. I've been poking around, and our DC lobbyists and even different House members and Senate members, nobody has seen anything, and they don't know what is even referenced when the president said that there's going to be more funds coming, especially for small business, and another round of stimulus for small businesses. That's not been clarified yet.
Okay. Thank you, Charles. If you have other questions and you need to follow up with him, then you can reach him at charles@nationalreia.org. So, are we ready? Chris Goff.
I'm ready.
Awesome. Looking
I
forward.
hope I'm ready. We'll see. See how it goes.
Looking forward to hear what you've got to say about Airbnb. This is the beginning this is the next in our series of alternate investing topics. We'll be running those through not just the end of the year, but probably bleeding over into the first of the year. And Chris is going to come on and tell us about something that you may have heard of before and know a little bit about, but he's going to expand on that and show you some things that you may not know. So Chris, can't wait to see it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me. Number one, let me get my screen up here. And hopefully you can see the screen, but you good to go? Can you see? Awesome. Number one, thanks for attending and really appreciate it. I am Chris Goff, the co-founder of REIPro, and I've got to tell you, this is probably one of the hottest concepts happening right now. And you don't have to live on a beach to do this, right? I mean, it's pretty much happening almost every city across the country. So since we have a short time together today, I'm not going to go super in depth on each particular strategy. We're going to get a good overview of that, or any kind of local laws. You definitely want to check your areas in reference to what I'm going to teach you here. So with further ado, let's just jump into it because we do have a lot of information to cover. Now, what is a vacation rental? I'm not going to hardly spend any time on this, other than the fact that people are not just, using vacation rentals from a single family home or a condo. People are actually buying RVs right now, and they're using them as vacation rentals. You think about it, you could get a pretty nice RV for $30,000 or $40,000. You can finance these over 20 years and then start using that as a vacation rental. And it's huge. You don't really hear a lot about from a RV or different types of property, but I'm here to tell you it's happening all over. So you definitely want to really, don't think of just a condo. Don't think of, just a single family house. I know most of you probably have been on some type of vacation before. I know I like to use either Airbnb or VRBO or HomeAway, one of these big three companies, because it's private. I'm going to get a lot more luxury typically from the property, and it's going on nonstop. Now, I live in Florida, and it seems like we have this pretty much 10 months out of the year, but this is really happening in so many different cities across the US. Number one, just research these companies if you decide to use one of these as a marketing platform, because they're definitely going to have different cost with them. So a question I get is, why would I do this? Why invest? There's obviously big reasons. I'm just going to cover those. Number one, higher income potential. When I think of renting properties as more of a long-term investment strategy, I remember we bought 18 one year, and we were making probably $200 or $300 a month. And I'm like, good Lordy, this doesn't even pay the electric bill where I'm at. So it's more kind of a long-term strategy where, using a vacation rental, you're really going to have a much higher monthly income rate. And along with demand has been pretty high. I'm going to give you some really cool free resources in this presentation that you can check out to see, what's going on in your area. Helps the local economy. I know a lot of people, they hate this, right? So if you're in a neighborhood and you've got 10 neighbors that are renting their property out and you got somebody new in it each week, people get really frustrated about this. But at the end of the day, it really does help the local economy. I remember just a few months back, San Diego, California, I think they brought in like $400 million in additional income just from people, renting these Airbnbs or, vacation rentals. So it does help the local economy grow. I would say goodbye to evictions because you don't have it with these short-term rentals. And a big reason of that is because you typically get paid up front, right? So there's no long eviction process to that. In general, maintenance is lower. I want you to think about when you rent one of these, vacation properties, you're not hanging pictures on the wall. Just imagine all the nail holes or moving furniture in and so on. So you're going to have a lot lower maintenance cost on the property. So where do we invest? And this is one of the free resources that I want to share with you guys. Number one thing is you definitely want to check your local state laws with this. There are areas that prohibit this. Nashville, Tennessee just this year came out with a whole new law just on what you can do, what is considered a short-term rental. And so you definitely want to check your local laws on this. But let me go back there. This company here, it's called airdna.co, not .com, but .co is a great resource to really see all of the current vacation rentals in just about every area. So it will compare, versus, Airbnb versus VRBO and so forth on what people are using as a marketing platform to get this property marketed out there. It'll also tell you the rents, what's going on, how much money could you potentially get from a 2-bedroom, 1-bath versus a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home. So it's a great free resource. They do have a paid plan to give you a lot more information, especially if you get real serious into this. You definitely check that out. So how do we market for these leads? I always say you should spend 90% of your time finding the deal. To me, that is the most important thing that any investor should be focusing on, because all of the other things really don't matter without the deal. And obviously, being the co-founder of REIPro, we make it extremely easy for you to search for these properties. I want to give you some filter criteria of what I would generally look at. So if you're an REIPro, you go to the lead generation. The number one thing I want to pull is vacant absentee owners. So properties that are vacant in REIPro, this comes directly from the United States Postal Service. So every vacant property is only deemed vacant by the Postal Service. So if somebody doesn't pick up their mail for at least 90 days, the postman, postwoman will come in and deem that property vacant, meaning we're not going to send any more mail there. Now, the great thing with REIPro is that we can actually pick up the forwarding address. So although we're picking up a vacant property where they're not delivering mail, we can get the forwarding address to that property and hope that our marketing material will get sent to them. And of course, absentee owners, that's a huge list of properties. But I want to set my minimum equity percentage at 20%. Now, that might sound crazy to a lot of people that wholesale properties, because we're not wholesaling properties. We can literally pay almost up to full price using either of the two strategies that I'm going to share with you today. So you think about how many investors actually market a property that has 20% equity, like nobody, right? So it's really going to separate. Keep in mind, we're not looking for necessarily distressed properties. I'm actually looking for properties that I don't have to put much money into. It's going to be in a nice area. So minimum equity, 20%. I also want to focus on the medium price range and above. Again, I want that nicer property. That's what a vacation rental is, right? Minimum 2 bedrooms. Again, you could do pretty much anything, but minimum 2. I personally invest single family condos, but you can apply this to just about anything in real estate. Last sold date, minimum 3 years. So I'm really looking for that tired landlord, tired of tenants. Maybe they inherited the property, not sure what to do with it, but it just so happens to be located in an area that I want to get this short-term vacation rental. And I like to remove any kind of company-owned properties, right? So I don't want to spend a lot of money in marketing, sending them to these big companies that may own property there. It's never going to get in the hands of the person that can actually make a decision. So I do like to work directly with the homeowner in this case. Just a general marketing postcard that we like to use. Again, it's just about being creative, right? So I always say you got to have that wow factor, that catchy hot, headline. So I put, are you tired of TTL, right? Tenants, toilets, late payments. And it's just something to grab someone's attention. Again, you don't have to use a postcard. You could use a letter. You could do skip tracing. You could do all of that within the REIPro system. Bold statement, we can pay up to full price. Like nobody ever says that, because every investor wants to get that huge, great deal, right? So a deep discount. Keep in mind, we're not really focused on that distressed property. We're looking for something that's already in livable shape, good location, just a good general area. So, and maybe we just need to put some lipstick on the property. Of course, learn more, and then a simple call to action. They could go to your website, a landing page, just to learn a little bit more about what you do, because not many people receive a postcard that says we could pay up to full price. And I think that's the catch right there. Now, when you do get into this business, you're going to have to furnish the property. I'm going to give you some places that, big one, obviously Amazon. House is a really good one. Overstock.com. Of course, you got Wayfair, but this is probably some of the best ones right here. And it's Nextdoor, Facebook Marketplace, and a Mercari local. They actually deliver straight to you. So you can get affordable stuff to furnish the property. You don't have to go in and spend an absolute fortune to do this. I always say, you should bring it to the level of the house and the type of person that you want in your property, and this is going to be very price dependent, neighborhood dependent, and so on. So you don't have to, put gold-plated doors on a 2-bedroom, 1-bath condo. You just got to fit that particular price point and neighborhood. So we gauge this, and this is a gauge. It's going to be a little different for everybody and the type of property that you have, but around $500 to $1,000 per room. Now, this would include everything. I'm talking about the sheets on the bed too. So everything should get around this 500 to 1,000. We like to spend a little more time on finding some really good deals, and not so much time that it's a waste of time, but enough that we can save. Because if you constantly do this and you get multiple properties doing this, it could cost you a lot of money and wasted money that you don't need to put into the property if you just took a little bit of extra time searching for, some cheaper, better quality stuff. So how do we just invest in vacation rentals? Just to keep one obvious, if you have cash, obviously you could pay cash for the property and then turn it into a short-term rental. You could get financing. Another way is to do a lease option, and then what we call seller finance, some of more of the creative financing. And that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation, is how do we do it creatively? I think this is kind of a not so taught subject. You could go to YouTube, you can see stuff out there, but this is what's going to separate you from the competition, is understanding how do we do this with creative financing. You could always get traditional financing, but you're only going to be able to borrow so much money, and what happens when you can't borrow any more money? And that's where the creative financing really comes into play. This also works great for the investor that's getting started, that doesn't have a ton of money to invest in. They want to do something different. They don't want to do the same old, but they're just getting started. And vacation rentals is a great thing. I love what Warren Buffett says. He says you can't do what is popular and do well. So to me, using any kind of creative financing is already different than what I would say would be popular. And it's so true. All right, so just a real quick, what is the basic definition of this? And when I say lease option, rent to own, lease purchase, essentially they're all the exact same thing. So it's taking control without taking the actual title to the property. And I always say you either own the property or you control the property. And I think as an investor, you want to learn how to do both. It's not one or the other. It's understanding how to do both. I always like to tell people that, I teach and coach and so forth, is that you should be able to go to any seller, and when they tell you their situation, you should have a solution. And it could be multiple solutions. It's not always just cash me out solution. It could be controlling the property using one of these creative financing. So simply defined, a lease option is a lease agreement combined with a purchase agreement. So through this lease option agreement, a buyer leases the property. Usually from all the deals that I've done, it's 1 to 3 years. You can go longer, you can technically go shorter, and then has the right or option to purchase that property on or before the end of the agreement. So technically I could buy or cash the seller out tomorrow by getting additional financing, or I could go all the way up to the end of the term. So just to keep it real simple, you have a lease agreement plus a purchase agreement. That's going to be that lease option agreement or lease purchase agreement or rent to own agreement, all the same thing. So why lease options? Number one is very little competition. I think people have heard of it. 20% of car sales are done on a lease to own program. 75% of airplane sales are done on a lease to own program. You have rent to own furniture. It's like, what happened to real estate? And again, there's a few states out there that, it makes it a little difficult, such as Texas. And, but overall, you have very little competition. People don't understand how to connect the dots. I understand what it is, but how do you do it? Okay, but if I do that, then what's next? So it's really kind of connecting the dots and turning it into a business. So this is great for the person that wants that passive income. They want income on a property that they control versus a property that they own. Little money down. Rarely do we put a lot of money down. You think about if a landlord is renting a property out and they collect a security deposit, generally that security deposit is the first month's rent. That could be different. It could be more or less, but it's roughly about the same as the monthly payment. So I like to keep this money down that as for what I call option money, right around what a owner would receive if they took a security deposit, but just a little bit more, just to make it look more attractive than just renting their property out. No bank qualification up front because we're not actually taking ownership of the property. We are controlling the property with the lease option agreement. No credit checks. I say no credit checks. Could some people want to get a credit check? Absolutely, they could. But generally, these are tired landlords that we deal with. I think if you build the relationship in the beginning, when you're talking to the seller, it's very rare that a seller would come to me and say, hey, I don't trust you. I want to do a credit check on you. It is very normal for a seller to say that to somebody that hasn't built the trust. They haven't built that relationship with the owner. No lowball offers. I think this is one of the awesome parts about a lease option because we could actually pay up to full price because we're not making our money necessarily on the sales price. We're making it on what's called terms. In terms is how much down, how much a month, and how long can we do it for? So the terms part of it, which I'm going to show you, is where we make good money with this. More deals to work. Well, it's pretty simple. There are less distressed properties than there are nice properties. And that opens up a pretty big marketplace. You just think about, just medium price range marketplace and even above is a great place to be in. No landlord headaches. Generally with a lease option, we put in our contract that the tenant buyer is going to be responsible for up to $500 a month in maintenance cost and repairs. So that eliminates that, hey, Mr. Landlord, come fix my light bulb and toilet and all that stuff, because we're going to make the buyer feel a part of this deal. And they have invested interest because ultimately they're going to buy this property. Large pool of renters out there, right? So think about how many people would love to get in a deal like this that they can't go to the bank right now because they either don't have good enough credit or they don't have enough for a down payment. So this is a good way to give a buyer some time to fix that debt to income. Now, I'm not talking about the person that has terrible credit. I'm talking about the person that actually is very close. So we have them work with a mortgage broker. Our mortgage broker will give them basically a roadmap that says, you need to do this in the next 10 to 11 months in order to qualify for a loan for this property. So we like to give them a roadmap. You control it, not own it. Some of the seller benefits real quick, they could receive up to full price. They get a non-refundable down payment. So unlike a security deposit, which would be refundable if they took care of the house, This also would be applied to the purchase price. No or little maintenance cost, receive positive cash flow. They get to retain title to the house. They're still building equity as if they were renting it. Avoid capital gains right now because they're not selling it right now. It could cover their monthly payment. Maybe they're just motivated that, hey, maybe you got a job promotion, you got to move to Des Moines, Iowa, and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I could sell my house. Maybe I could rent it because I'm not going to be able to afford the mortgage payment on this property and the mortgage payment on my new property. Avoids home vacant solution to selling, and smarter than renting, assuming that the owner wants to get cashed out within the next year, 2, or even 3 years. And look at it from a short-term rental point of view now. You could actually do a cash flow split with the owner. Now, of course, as the investor, I want to make as much as I possibly can on this deal, but you may run into a seller that says, I don't have a clue on how to do what you do, but I totally see an opportunity with this. You could get in the middle of this deal, do it as a short-term rental, and actually split the cash flow and any other profits that you may have. Short-term rentals also could have a lot of upsells at the property so it's not just the cash flow piece to it. All right, so let me give you just a lease option example. I'll try to keep this as simple as possible, especially if you've never seen this before. So we have a single family home, let's say 4-bedroom, 2-bath, 2,500 square foot. The rent value on this property is $2,650, and the home value would be $365. What I want you to do is sign a lease option agreement with the seller, and we'll set this price at $350. Now, wait a second, Chris, you said it's worth $365. I can tell you just about any property that you go in, you're going to find something wrong, right? It could be just painting, cleaning, whatever it may be, you're going to find some stuff wrong. Also look at it from this point of view. If I listed this property with a realtor to sell it, I'd also have to deduct the commission off of that. So sometimes when I come in with an offer, I like to come in just a little bit higher than that, assuming that the seller is willing to wait a little bit longer to sell the property. We're going to do a down payment of $2,500 and a monthly payment of $2,500. Now, I get it. It rents for $2,650, but my offer is going to come in a little bit less than that. All right, it's just a little slow on the PowerPoint. Hold on. Let me go back. We're going to do a term of 3 years. You can do a term of 1 year. It does make it a lot more difficult when we're talking about a short-term rental. I really want to go 2 to 3 years. So always ask for more. And you'd be surprised. A lot of sellers are like, heck yeah, I'll go 3 years because I won't have to worry about turnover, vacancies, repairs, and all that stuff that, landlords think about. So they're more likely to probably take a longer term. All right, so you will have some preparation cost. I want you to think about, I'm going to have to come up with $2,500 to put down. Think about the first month's rent. Also furnishing. So this is just an example. It's going to change a little bit depending on the property of $8,000. I'm going to have an initial cleaning at $500. I'm going to have a photographer come in, and I get it. The new iPhones, we're talking about Apple, they have great cameras and they're really good. I really, really recommend having a professional photographer come in because I want you to think about, you're going to have those photos forever. Okay. So have that. It's a one-time cost too. And just some miscellaneous costs, $500 I'm throwing into it. Now we go and come on, PowerPoint. It is a little slow. There we go. Total cost $14,300. I want you to think about, I've got to come up with this amount of money to do this deal. So monthly income and expenses, I have already obviously checked the rental rates on what I could get for this property would be $6,000 per month. You're going to have a hosting fee. This example, $180. I'm going to have a cleaning fee that's going to be nonstop throughout the month. Again, depending on how many times you rent it within that month. And then keep in mind, we got to pay the owner $2,500 every single month. Other fees are going to be very dependent on where you live and where this property is. You could have some local state taxes that are included as well. You would need to check and verify that. So total income on here is $1,325. So let's kind of keep going with this. So my upfront cost in this property is going to be $11,800 because I'm going to commence the lease option agreement 30 days after I actually sign the agreement. And that's going to give me time to furnish the property, clean the property, market the property, and actually get somebody in the property. So I'm looking at that first month payment. It's going to be a wash for me. All right, come on. So if you look at this, it would actually take me, remember, I'm only profiting $1,325. It would take me 9 months just to recuperate this cost, okay? Also keep in mind, we're paying near full sales price. The down payment is credited to the purchase price. You own all the furnishings because you had to buy it. Pictures are a one-time cost. So you don't own the home, so you really did save 20%, that you would have to put on this property. You look at even 10% of a $350,000 house is a lot of money. Think of 20% now. So we're not really putting in that much money to control this property. All right, so I want you to do this. I want you to vacation rental this for 2 years. Okay, so just think about, I'm just going to rent it. I'm going to rent it. I'm going to rent it as a short-term vacation rental. But the third year, because keep in mind, we have 3 years with the seller, that's when we're actually going to get a lease option buyer to come in that third year, because keep in mind, we have to cash the seller out on or before the end of these 3 years. So if we move to the next slide here, I want you to look at, so there's the original agreement that we have with the seller. Now I need to set the new terms with the new buyer. So I'm going to sell this property for $370. Now, keep in mind, it was worth $365. We put furnishings, we've enhanced the property, and it's 2 years later down the road. So I'm hoping that we can actually sell this for the $370. Down payment, I normally go anywhere between 3 to 5% of the purchase price, and that's just a general rule of thumb for me. But in this case, $12,000. Remember, the monthly rent, assuming that it didn't go up or go down, was $2,650. And we're going to do this on a term of 1 year. Number one, I never go longer than 1 year with a new buyer. And number two, we only have 1 year left with the seller. So our first profit center is the difference in the down payment. So if the new buyer is giving me 12, we paid the seller $2,500. Remember, we've already reimbursed ourselves that $2,500 through the cash flow in that first 9 months. Okay, so our first profit center is going to be 100% of that down payment. Our second profit center is going to be the difference in monthly rent. So the buyer's paying us $2,650, we're paying the seller $2,500. And our third profit center is the difference in sales price. Now, I know if you're looking at the sales price, $370 and $350, it's not $20,000, because keep in mind, we have to subtract the actual down payment from that. So if the new buyer is buying it for $370, you have to subtract the 12 from that, and that would be their balance. If you look at you and the seller, you're buying it for $350 minus the $2,500, that would be your balance. Now, when this goes to closing, yes, you're going to have some closing cost on here. So, but I'm just trying to keep the example simple as I possibly can. So let's look at the summary. The first year, we didn't really make that much money, $4,100 on that, because we reimbursed our initial expense. And think about this, if you reimburse all the money that you have in the property, what is your return on investment there? And you don't even own the property, and you don't even live in the property. The second year, we're going to benefit from all that nice short-term, income that's coming in. So $15,900, again, under the assumption that it was rented out 365 days, which it probably wouldn't be, but it could be very close. And then the third year, if we can speed that up, 24,300 if you added in the profits from the lease option buyer. So it gives you a total profit here, 44,300. Now, doesn't sound like a lot of money when you look at it from just one deal, but if you did 10 of these, it really does change everything. They always say, one restaurant doesn't make you a killing, but if you had 10 of those restaurants, you really start to make a lot of money with it. So in this example, we'll go second year, 159, third year, 243,000 and 443. Now, if I recuperate all of my money, I really have no more money invested into this. So the return on investment is extremely high. Otherwise, you'd have to put 20% down on all of these properties. In any down payment money, I always tell people, all of your down payment money, you're just buying your own equity in the property. I mean, that's pretty much it. You're getting it back, but you're just buying your own equity. So this is a extremely profitable way to do a lease option, very creative way to do a lease option and use it as a short-term vacation rental. The second strategy to this is seller financing. To me, this is a big strategy. There's a lot of moving parts to this, but once you get it, it's really not too difficult. So this is the situation where a seller acts as a financial institution, receiving payments towards the purchase of a property. So ultimately, what we're saying is the seller becomes the bank. And we're doing this with just paperwork. Now, there's all kinds of ways to seller finance a house. I mean, there's a lot more ways, just even typical seller financing. You probably heard of a wraparound mortgage. You would only use that if the seller had an existing mortgage on it. You hear about the sub 2. Well, a sub 2 is within a mortgage or wraparound agreement that says if there is existing, financing on the property, it would be subject to. But there's a lot of other types of seller financing. You have substitution of collateral. I did a great video on subordination, which is a real creative way to owner finance properties. It's some others out there. So you definitely want to go back and learn both these strategies, but on a seller finance point of view, is there are multiple ways to do it. So you definitely want to absorb yourself into these particular strategies. Some of the big reasons I love seller finance is actually 4 ways to get it with no money down. At the end of the day, always typically give the seller money down because they seem to trust you a lot more when you do. But there are ways to get in with no money down. Low fixed interest rate. I don't want to go in super high, pay 8-10% on this. I really want to come in as low as I possibly can. Could it be a little bit higher than, if you were to got a mortgage? Probably, but not too much higher. It's really not going to affect my monthly payment all that much. And think about what our exit strategy is, which is renting it short term. So not that big of a deal to me. No bank qualification because we're not going to the bank begging for a loan, where you go, please give me a loan on this. No credit check, I always say, but a seller could ask for a credit check. They want to make sure you're credit worthy. Lower closing cost on this. And I say that because generally I'll have my attorney draw up all the seller finance paperwork and I'll have him just, send the owner the paperwork and we close it that way. You can also close it at a title company, officially. But I like to really have my attorney draw up the paperwork. It's not something I want you to do and ultimately could lower the cost. Won't show up on your credit report. We said years ago before all these new laws changed that if it's not on your credit report, you could buy as many as you possibly can get your hands on. And that's one of the beauties of seller finance. It's also easy to sell to another buyer. If I went to a buyer and said, no, you don't have to go to the bank. You don't have to put 20% down. It's just easy to get into. I mean, most people would probably just rather do that. I mean, why put all this money down to invest? Let me give you an example here. In this example, I have amortized all of the numbers for you. You could always go back and double check, but the balance here with the seller's current mortgage. So this is a property where the seller has a current mortgage. Years left, 15. Their taxes and insurance is 308. So total payment here for the seller's 1525.15. We're going to create a seller finance agreement. In this case, it would be a wraparound agreement with a subject to clause in it for $325. And keep in mind, yes, we're comping out the properties. We're making sure that the value is there. Down payment, I'm going to try to get in as low as I possibly can because this is cash out of your pocket. You always want to try to get in as low as possible. We have an interest rate at 3%. Of course, start low. And if you've got to move up, then move up. And I like to do what's called a term of 5 years. So in real estate, we call it a balloon payment. Now, I'm amortizing the loan over 30 years to keep the monthly payment down, but with a term of 5 years. So what I'm going to do is ultimately make payments every month for 5 years. Whatever my balance owed is after the 5 years, I have to cash the seller out. But because I own the property with the seller finance, unlike a lease option where you control it, with the seller finance, I can now do what's called a refinance. So it's a lot easier now for you to get financing by doing it this way. So our monthly payment in this case comes out to $1,349.13. Taxes and insurance, $308. Again, that would carry over. So our total payment to the seller here, $1,657. Now, from a seller point of view, this may not seem like a home run deal, but if they don't have to take care of the maintenance cost, repairs, and they have to have some type of motivation, you're just not going to go to a seller that has a house listed on realtor.com and say, hey, I'm going to give you full price for it, but I've got to do it this way. Usually there's some type of motivation behind it. All right, so in this example, if we did a short-term rental, or remember, we're going to get $6,000 a month minus our total payment, and then hosting fee, cleaning fee. So our total monthly income on this could be really, really good. And again, that's assuming if you had it rented out for all 30 days, you probably won't, but just keeping the example simple. So let's fast forward this 5 years. If the balance is 284, okay, total payments on this property with the interest 388, what do I do now? Well, the first thing you could do is refinance the property because we have to cash the seller out of what our balance owed is, which is the 284. The cool part showing the owner is, look, over 5 years, I'm actually paying $388,000 for the property, not, what we originally agreed on because of the interest and the payments that we're making. You could technically sell the property because you own the property, right? You could obviously extend the agreement with the seller if they agree. Let's say that you couldn't cash them out. You couldn't go to the bank at that point. You could extend that agreement possibly. Now, why would the seller ever agree to this? Well, maybe they don't need cash up front. There's a lot of times I'll go to the seller and say, if I paid you cash today, what would you do with it? A lot of people, it would just sit in the bank. So you might as well use the property as an investment and, earn a little bit of money off of that money. Maybe they can't sell for cash. Obviously, foreclosures, pre-foreclosure, anytime we work with foreclosures, if you're not paying cash for the property, it is a seller finance strategy. Maybe they're tired of making repairs. Obviously, eliminate stress. There could be thousands of different reasons. And I still believe you have to have some type of motivation here outside the investor that's like, Chris, I'm just tired of tenants. I love the income, but I'm tired of tenants. I'm tired of toilets and all the things that come along with being a landlord. I'll just show you one of our students here uses REIPro, found this property through REIPro. It's a vacation rental. This is actually near Ryan, very close to Ryan, actually. And it was just a small 2-bedroom, 2-bath home here. And we actually seller financed this for $900,000. Now, those of you that live, in a small town in Oklahoma, that little house for $900,000, well, that's South Florida for you, right? So assuming that you're in a good location, you put $60,000 into rehab on this. So he gets $3,000 to $5,000 per week in rent. And I'm going to show you why here in a second. 8 to 10,000 a month. And this is the time of the year is dependent on how much he can actually get, the seasons here. So this property's current value, because he remodeled it and put it in a really great condition, is now worth $1.5 million. If you just even look at that, just let's assume he's got $1 million invested in this with the purchase price, rehab, and miscellaneous costs. He's already made $500,000 on this property without even renting it at this point. So these are just some of the pictures. He did have, just showing you some of the rehab pictures. He did have a professional photographer come in, and you can find him on Facebook there. Small little kitchen, but that's where it's located. I don't know if you can see that little red arrow there at the bottom of that picture to the right. So it's easy access to the beach. And he actually bought another property 2 houses down from this particular property. The owner of the property saw him rehabbing it and said, "Hey, are you buying houses?" "Yeah, we're looking to buy." He bought a house 2 doors down, which is pretty awesome. And I just want to share with you, if getting into this business, and just for anybody, even if you're just getting started, he sent me this text. This is just a few months ago, by the way. This was not something that happened 10 years ago. Okay. I'm going to zoom it in. It says, "Hey, Chris, hope you're doing well. Wanted to share a success story. About 90 days ago, he closed on another beach house. It was on the market for $1.125 million. It was able to get it for $810,000. What we tell people, if you find the right motivation, it's all about timing, and you build that trust, you can get in and get deals like this. And everybody's like, "Oh, you're crazy. You can't buy property like that where I live." And it's like, you're crazy because you're not really in the business. You don't understand it. So with a bit of luck and timing, just put it under contract for $1.13 million while putting $30,000 into it. That's a $290,000 profit. It could be big. Now, he didn't use this particular property as a vacation rental, but because of the property he did use as a vacation rental, led him into another deal, which, these are home run deals for a lot of people, but they're there. You just got to take action. You got to get out there. So let me give you just a few tips here to get started. I think, the big thing for me is understanding the strategy. It's really understanding the foundation of what a lease option is, a seller finance strategy is. Research the market. I've given you a free resource here. It's pretty awesome to use. Start marketing for deals. You could get into REIPro, pull the leads up right away from a vacant absentee owner, and immediately start marketing these properties. Research furnishing companies, as we talked about. And number one, make the offer. People are so scared to make offers. You'll never make money in this business if you don't make the offer, right? And could you, and I'm a firm believer, especially those that may follow me, is make multiple offers. You don't have to make just a lease option offer or a seller finance offer or a cash offer. Make all 3. You're going to get it one way or the other. And what I love about multiple offers is that the seller gets so confused on which offer to take, they fail to realize they didn't have to take any of the offers. So they're more likely, our acceptance ratio went up 60% when we started making multiple offers. Here's 2 of the strategies for you. Implement it with short-term rentals, or you could just use it for any kind of real estate deal. But if you have any questions, we'd love to answer it. Those of you that are not familiar with REIPro, like Rebecca was talking about, there's Katrina's contact information. You can contact Katrina about REIPro if you have any questions getting it out to your members and so on. So I think I'm done. I know that was a lot of information in a short period of time. I hope you could just kind of see the passion that I have with it and run with these strategies.
Chris, thank you. That was a ton of information in a short amount of time. So we really appreciate your packing all that in for us in our session today. The big question that we have is, where can they get more information and how can they follow up with you?
So information with REIPro, you could go to either, Katrina Hand can help answer any kind of questions about REIPro, any kind of investing stuff. I've got a ton of YouTube videos out there. If you just Google my name, it'll pop up there. But you can contact us at myreipro.com, for any kind of needs that you're looking for, from education to obviously the software, and we'll help walk you through it. And I think that's one of the big things that I think we forget about in real estate, Rebecca, is that one of the big things we put in the REIPro system is what we call our executable steps. It's the physical things you have to do in a specific order to make something happen. We're literally holding someone's hand, from, a member at your REIA, just holding their hand through the process and showing people what to do next. So I would highly encourage you guys to jump into REIPro and check that out. It's not just leads. It's about a full circle thing, from direct mail, skip tracing, your properties, running comps. We do have MLS comps throughout all 50 states. So go to myreipro.com.
Awesome. Thank you. And that circles back to someone else asked how they access the vacant property list from the post office. And that's inside of REIPro, like you were talking about. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
So, and not just vacants, but absentee owners, pre-foreclosures, and a lot of other types of leads that you'd be looking for.
So Lori put the link to myreipro.com. And please keep in mind that if you're a National REIA member, which means if you're a member of a local group that's connected to National, then those members of ours receive a discount on pricing with REIPro. They are a benefit provider and a supporter of ours. And Chris, we're really thankful to you for that. We know our members love the product. So thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely.
Thanks for all you do for us. And we look forward to seeing you back at some point, because we know that REIPro has lots of goodies wrapped inside of it that we can talk about to help with investing. So thank you again.
Absolutely. And one last thing, Rebecca, we have
Yes, sir.
something pretty phenomenal coming out at the beginning of the year. And, it's hard for me to talk because I got to keep my mouth shut about it, but it's definitely going to change the way that we look at real estate investing. And so I can't wait to share that with you guys first as we get closer to the end of the year. But thanks for listening. Thanks for participating, and everyone have a great weekend.
So Chris, we'll bring you back on so you can give them an update when that gets closer to release time. So let us know about that. And
Absolutely.
for those of you that are here and are interested, we'll put that into our notes when the release comes out. So,
And guys, listen, I just want to also say as well, just knowing Chris Goff, being friends with him, and also sort of, he's been a mentor to me as well. As a lot of you guys know, down in Broward and Miami-Dade REIAs, we have a very successful mentor program. Chris is one of the reasons of that. He is someone that has really kind of guided me in the beginning of creating this mentor program, because he is what I consider one of the top educators in real estate. If you watch his videos, just listening to him talk today, it just comes so natural to him teaching people. And he just, he's one of my favorite educators in real estate. So whenever, Chris is teaching something, my ears are always piqued. But also REIPro is something that we use as well. My new team for my new company that we're developing all over the state of Florida, we're using a lot of REIPro as well. It's a great program, guys. So definitely check it out. And if you're going to get somebody to educate you in real estate, Chris Goff is the man.
Thank you.
thanks, Ron. I'll let you continue to sign us off, sir.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you guys for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much to our CEO, Charles Tassell, the man on the street that has the word from Washington, D.C., keeping us updated on all these important legislative updates. Thank you so much to Chris Goff and REIPro, Rebecca and Lori and everybody at National REIA and the team for putting this together today. And for all of you guys joining us, we will see you guys October the 15th on Friday, same place, same time. Have a great weekend.